Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon 1000 Schabbos hat es getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem,
Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is about Jews in Poland in the 19th century, and Polish patriotism specifically, and it really revolves around the somewhat strange story of the chief rabbi of Krakow and later of Warsaw in the mid-19th century, Rav Dov Ber Meizlish. And his fame, he was a rabbi of these towns, but his primary fame came as a result of his outspoken Polish patriotism, especially during the Polish revolts against Austrian and Czarist Russian rule of the 19th century. So I thought it's an interesting story. In the partitions of Poland in the late 18th century divided the Polish kingdom, ended the Polish kingdom, and brought them under the control of three distinct empires: the Austrian Empire, the area of Galicia, and the area of northwestern Poland under the Prussian German Empire, and most of Poland, most of the Polish kingdom, under Czarist Russia. So he is in Krakow. Rav Dov Ber Meizlish is in Krakow, which was, it's even more complicated because it started out in Austria. Later on, it was independent, that kind of like was its own little republic. And then later on, it was once again in Austria. But okay, either way, the empires that gobbled up Poland, they were empires of central rule, central authority, and they did not want to continue the autonomous nature of the different ethnic groupings within the empire, ethnic or religious groupings within the empire. That included the Jewish community. So they were consistently passing legislation to remove the power of the Kahal, of the Jewish communal autonomy, the Jewish communal courts, the Batei Din, and of the rabbinate, because that's the way the modern era worked. The modern era took the power to the state, to the central government, with one system of laws applicable to all the citizens. In many instances, including in the Austrian Empire, they would eventually grant emancipation and equal rights and citizenship to all its citizens, including the Jews. So the rabbinate in Galicia and Congress Poland during the 19th century is undergoing a process of struggle because it's during a time of change where the state, the government, is taking away its power, is removing the power of the rabbinate. And this is also part of the story of Rav Dov Ber Meizlish. So another thing to keep in mind in the background is that the Poles were not excited about losing their independence and about being partitioned among these different empires. So there was a series of Polish revolts against both Czarist Russia and Austria throughout the 19th century, or at least throughout the mid-19th century. There was 1830, 31, 1846, 1848, 1861, 1863, until the empires completely crushed any Polish nationalism, Polish tendency to revolt. They completely destroyed it, and it was no Poland until after World War I. But there were all these Polish revolts and spurts of Polish patriotism and Polish nationalism, and the question is what the relationship of the Jewish community to those revolts. So I wanted to use Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, first of all, because he was probably the most prominent, outspoken rabbi regarding Polish patriotism during that time. So it's reflective of, at least the outlier. He's definitely the outlier. Most mainstream rabbinical figures of the 19th century in Galicia and Central Poland did not have the same, similar biography that he did. But, he's a good case study, so to speak. And there's also a million sources on him. So much is written about him, both Jewish and non-Jewish, because the Polish sources also wrote a ton about him. He became like this symbol of Jewish destiny in Poland. And there's loads and loads of sources. I personally read from Chaim Gertner, Rachel Mencken, and many, many others that have written about him. So he's such an enigmatic figure. He was born in 1798, and he lived until 1870. So he lived most of the 19th century. He was born into a prominent rabbinical family, married into a wealthy family. So he was part of the oligarchy, the elite of the Jewish community in the 19th century. He became a partner in a prominent banking firm. So he was engaged in banking and business. He was quite wealthy, one of the wealthiest Jews in Poland. And he was always a Polish patriot. In the November uprising of 1831, he financed the acquisition of ammunition for the Polish rebels. In 1832, a year later, he was appointed the rabbi of Krakow. In 1846, he was elected to the Austrian parliament. So he became a representative of Krakow. He wasn't representative of the Jews of Krakow. In other words, he wasn't like some sort of Jewish political party. He was elected as the representative of the people of the Krakow area. I don't know how to describe it. In other words, he was Jewish, obviously. He was a rabbi, but he was not elected as a Jew. He was elected to the Parliament of Austria. In 1857, the second chief rabbi of Warsaw, Reb Chaim Davidson, passed away. And there was a big dispute in Warsaw as to who would succeed him. There was two locals in Warsaw. One represented the Hasidic community, Reb Itcha Meyer. I think then he was still Rottenburg. Later on he was Alter, known as the Chidushei Harim of Ger, but he lived in Warsaw most of his life. He was the candidate submitted by the Hasidic community in Warsaw, and the Misnagdic, or non-Hasidic community in Warsaw, wanted another local, also a wealthy businessman actually, Reb Yaakov Gesundheit, the author of the Tiferes Yaakov, to become the rabbi. So, because they could not resolve this dispute as to who would succeed Reb Chaim Davidson, so Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, who had left the rabbinate in Krakow for other reasons, we'll hopefully get to that as well, he was brought in as a compromise candidate. So in 1857, he became the chief rabbi of Warsaw, the largest city in Poland, and obviously the largest, obviously the former capital, and it was also the largest Jewish community in Poland, but even already at this early stage. He was a very active participant in the last great Polish revolt of 1863 against Czarist Russia. By now he's moved from Krakow to Warsaw. Warsaw's in Congress Poland, that's considered part of Czarist Russia, so the Polish revolt was against the Czarist Russian government, and that is his primary legacy. He was banned from Warsaw by the government for because of his participation in the revolt. He was allowed to return there eventually, and when he returned, he maintained a much lower profile, and he dedicated most of his time in his later years to writing his Sefer, studying Torah and teaching Torah, and writing his Sefer on the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam, a commentary. He had less public activism in his last years following the revolt. But he was remembered by the general Polish population, again, the non-Jewish Polish population, as a famous patriot. To a certain extent until today, when I bring the groups to the Poland Museum of Polish Jewish History in the center of Warsaw, 1,000 years of Polish Jewish history, so there's like a prominent exhibit about Rav Dov Ber Meizlish in the 19th century exhibit of the gallery of the museum. So until today, he's like this symbol of the destiny of Jews in Poland, and he's become a symbol of Polish-Jewish relations, the shared fate of Poles and Jews, the status of Jews in Polish society, the Jewish relationship to Polish nationalism and Polish patriotism. It always revolves around that. In other words, no one's saying that he was the mainstream, as far as I know. But the question revolves around him. How much did he represent a mainstream view or not? How many Jews identified with it? How throughout history was it like this? He became like this symbol. Now, one can view that in the Polish context, or one can also view it in the context of any other country in which Jews were or even currently are loyal patriots, and what that says regarding Jewish history and destiny in that particular country. In other words, I feel that the story of Rav Dov Ber Meizlish is such an important story and relevant story because patriotism is a rather common Jewish trait, especially in the modern era, in whatever country they lived in, and including Jewish leaders. So, we can use Rav Dov Ber Meizlish as a case study to extrapolate from that what the position of Jews regarding patriotism to their country in whatever diaspora it is throughout history. Why was Rav Dov Ber Meizlish a Polish patriot, and what were his goals? What was he trying to promote in Polish-Jewish relations? What were his goals for the Jewish community? These are the questions that one can ask when trying to understand the story of Rav Dov Ber Meizlish. So the reality is he was always wealthy, so he was a prominent person. He was very connected to the elite because of his bank and his wealth and his prominence in the community. He was always an activist. He was charismatic. He was smart. He knew people. So he had that from his youth. Even before he became rabbi, he was already prominent in Krakow society. Now, in 1831, the rabbi of Krakow, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Halevi, passed away. Now you have to remember again, let's take another step back. Krakow is one of the oldest, largest, and most prestigious Jewish communities in Poland for centuries. And now it's in a fluctuating political situation, or a volatile political situation, because Krakow till today is considered the capital of Western Galicia, in other words, the western part of southern Poland. And initially, following the third partition in 1795, it was in the Habsburg Austrian Empire. But after the Napoleonic Wars, there was the Congress of Vienna, and the Krakow area, not just the city of Krakow, the vicinity of Krakow, was made an independent republic. So it kind of had like this miniature Polish independence, which was obviously not completely independent. It was under the influence of the Austrian Empire. But then in 1846, it was again formally annexed to the Austrian Habsburg Empire. So the situation where the Rav Dov Ber Meizlish's world and his Jewish community is in a state of very, very volatile political situation. So after Tzvi Hirsch Halevi, the chief rabbi of Krakow, passed away in 1831, so there were two locals who were considered for the position of successor as rabbi in Krakow. Both were great Torah scholars. Both were local. In other words, they were not being imported from another city in Poland. They both lived and to a certain extent grew up in Krakow. Both were from very prominent families, well-known families, prominent families, miyuchis. And interestingly enough, both were very, very wealthy businessmen on the side. Not just Torah scholars, but they were also wealthy businessmen. Rav Meizlish himself, like I said, was an especially wealthy banker, financier. His father-in-law, who he married into this wealthy family, so his father-in-law had these investments in the salt mines near Krakow. Rav Dov Ber Meizlish was even allowed to have a home outside the Kazimierz historical Jewish quarter of Krakow. He was able to have a home, quite a large home, in the regular city of Krakow. Both were well-known activists and community leaders, and each had their own supporters. I don't know did I mention the other guy's name? No, I didn't. I guess I should have written that on my notes too. His name was Rav Shaul Landau. He also was wealthy, and he was known to have the largest mansion within the Jewish quarter. In fact, it was right next door to the Ramaz Shul on Soroka Street in the Jewish quarter. So they each had their own supporters, but it was obviously up to the Kahal, and even more so than the Kahal itself was the government. The government was going to decide who is the recognized official chief rabbi of the city. Now, both of these, Rav Shaul Landau and Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, were not Hasidic, which was the case, by the way, in most aristocratic old rabbinic Polish families of that time. It was only later in the 19th century that many rabbis were Hasidic. But both got along with the Hasidic community, which was gaining in prominence in Krakow, such that the divide was not along the lines of Hasidim and their opponents, which some like to present this dispute as such, but it was not the case. The Kahal ultimately appointed Rav Dov Ber Meizlish. The government approved the appointment, and he was duly installed officially as the rabbi. So the Rav Shaul Landau faction did not recognize his appointment, and they had an alternative Bezdin, where Rav Shaul Landau served as the Av Bezdin. Let's put that aside, and we'll get to that later, because this is part of the story of Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, how he's remembered on the outside of the community in one way, but within the community, this dispute really never went away. It stayed with him the whole time that he remained in Krakow. Now, Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, upon ascension to the rabbinate, he immediately engaged in all kinds of shtadlonis type of activity, communal activism, representing the Jewish community's interest to the government, which is what he excelled at, essentially. He was very talented, he was very charismatic, he had a lot of good connections. Like I said, he was also very wealthy, he had great communication skills, he also was articulate, he knew languages, he knew Polish, he knew German. How well he knew it, in fact, is a great historical dispute. It's funny that this is something that historians like to talk about. Some testimonies dismiss it. Like, his Polish and German was pretty lousy. He didn't speak it so well. And others say, he was able to articulate the Jewish community's needs in the language of the country because he was so good at Polish and German, and it's something that is unclear. But he definitely was able to converse. The question is how good. He had a lot of open lines of communication with non-Jewish leadership and governmental figures, cultivated relationships, and the non-Jewish political, religious, and business leadership he was able to connect with. In this way, he was able to assist the Jewish community and its development. This was a time of change, in particular for the position of the officially recognized rabbi, especially in the major cities, in the eyes of the government. The government implemented all sorts of measures, all kinds of legislation, some draconian, and some were understandable, to limit the power of the Kahal and the rabbinate and Jewish autonomy in general, or any autonomy in general. This was which I mentioned before, was the transition from the medieval form of governance, with there being ethnic and religious and tribal autonomy, to the modern era. And the modern era is the era of central government, with a consistent set of laws for all its citizens. And this is the form of government we all are familiar with today. This is the government of the United States and all countries of the world, pretty much. But you have to imagine a time when, in the pre-modern era, in the medieval era, the Kahal and the rabbinate were basically independent. They were autonomous. And here, they're being legislated to relinquish their autonomous power they held for centuries. The power of the Bezdin was being stripped as well. It was definitely not a simple process. It was quite complicated, and it took many decades. And Rav Dov Ber Meizlish was trying to mitigate the situation as the chief rabbi of Krakow by trying to intercede with the government to not take away the power of the rabbinate and of the kahal. In 1846, Krakow, like I said before, ceased to be an independent entity and was returned to Austrian control. In 1854, Rav Dov Ber Meizlish's adversary, Reb Shaul Landau, who was head of the rival Bezdin in town, which I mentioned, he passed away. So it was from 1832 when he was installed as rabbi till 1854 with the passing of Reb Shaul Landau. That's 22 years, almost his entire tenure. There was this internal communal dispute with not everyone recognizing his rabbinical authority. In 1856, only 2 years later, Rav Dov Ber Meizlish and the Krakow Jewish community parted ways under somewhat mysterious circumstances. But what we do know is his rabbinical contract was terminated, and a year later he was appointed rabbi of Warsaw. Now, following his departure, the Krakow community struggled to find a replacement. For 5 years, no one served as rabbi, and it was only 1861 that Reb Shimon Seifer, the son of the Chassam Seifer, was appointed rabbi of Krakow. In that same year, 1861, the Great Polish Uprising broke out against Czarist Russian rule. Now, by that time, Rav Dov Ber Meizlish was in Warsaw. He was the rabbi of Warsaw. A year later, in 1857, he had become the rabbi of Warsaw. So he is in Warsaw in 1861 when the first stage of the Polish uprising, I should say, because the second and main stage was 2 years later in 1863. And it was then that Rav Dov Ber Meizlish achieved his most impressive fame among Jews and Poles alike. He became this symbol of both Polish Jewish patriotism or nationalism and the Jewish participation in that said nationalism, as well as the common destiny of Jews and Poles. In hindsight, it was his character and life story which also came to symbolize another hotly debated topic in historiography until this very day. And the question is as follows: is Polish Jewish history a chapter in Polish history, or is it the history of Jews in Poland? And that's a very, very big distinction, and historians today debate this topic with a lot of passion and emotion. In Poland, primarily, Polish historians, there's this movement to understand over the past century that the history of Jews in Poland is a chapter in Polish history. It's part of Polish history. Or is it just Jewish history and it happened to have taken place in Poland? That's the chakira, I guess we could call it. I want to elaborate on some of his role in the revolt of 1861 and 1863. Because that's an interesting part of his story. Because he had this activism even before the revolts. He was activist in politics and the government. Like I said, he was elected to the Austrian parliament in 1846 already, and he was involved in the Polish revolt against Austria in already the 1830s. So there's all kinds of ways to understand his involvement in all this politics. What was his influence and leadership there? In fact, when he went to the government, that was seen as a like, here he's conforming to the government. He's participating in the government. That's not a rebellious revolter person, right? But then, when he got to the government, he joined the opposition seats in the government. In the Austrian parliament in Vienna, the opposition sat on the left, the liberal, the opposition against the government, and the conservatives sat on the right. And people expected Rav Dov Ber Meizlish to sit on the right because he's a religious rabbi, and religious clergy generally shifted to the right. to support the government, to support the empire, to support the wasn't the Kaiser, it was the emperor in Austria, and that's what he was expected. But he went to the opposition. He sat on the left, he sat with the liberals. And they asked him, why'd you do that? This became a very famous joke of his. His joke that he said was because, and this was a play on words in German, I think it works in English as well. He says, because in Austria, Jews have no rights. There's no Recht. The Jews don't have a right. So I have to sit on the left because Jews have no rights. And this is obviously before Jews achieve emancipation in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which came a little over 20 years later, in the 1860s, late 1860s. But in the 1840s, Jews still didn't have rights. So he said, I'm sitting by the liberals and the opposition on the left because Jews don't have rights, so I can't sit on the right. That was his play on word, the double meaning of the word right. So even when he was part of the government, he was making a statement in that regard as well. And he said it in German, so he knew German. Did he know German well? That was the question we said before. In any event, but if we move ahead to the 1861 revolt, he's already the rabbi in Warsaw. On February 27th, 1861, the Czarist Russian police shot 5 Polish rebels in the streets of Warsaw. This was considered a major pogrom, and one of them happened to have been Jewish, actually. He was a student at the rabbinical seminary in Warsaw. His name was Michael Landau, and Michael Landau was buried right away with a Jewish burial in the Jewish cemetery of Warsaw. But 3 days later, the other 4, the Polish Catholic rebels, were buried in a very, very famous funeral procession that became basically a parade of Polish nationalism and revolt against Czarist rule. And this became a very famous story in Rav Dov Ber Meizlish's life because he participated in that funeral. He walked with it. He was part of it. It was like a demonstration against Czarist rule. And this funeral for the 4 Polish martyrs, so to speak, who were killed by the Czarist police became a very big story. In fact, all the Jewish leadership of Warsaw did. There was a enlightened or progressive shul in Warsaw at the time. There was actually 2. One was called the Polish Enlightened Shul, and there the rabbi spoke in Polish, which was heretical to the Orthodox. And there was another enlightened progressive shul in Warsaw that it was called the German shul because they spoke in German. And then you had all the Orthodox shuls like Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, where he davened and where his shuls were. That was still in Yiddish. But the German shul, progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it, shul, the rabbi there was an imported German rabbi. His name was Rabbi Marcus Jastrow. I'm sure most listeners have heard his name because a few years after this revolt, probably because of his participation in the revolt, he had to leave Poland. He was a German citizen, so it was easy to stop him at the border. He not renew his visa, so to speak. So he was kicked out of Poland, and he moved to America, and he became a famous rabbi in the United States. And that's how people remember him, his dictionary and all that. But before that, he was a rabbi in Warsaw of this liberal shul. In fact, he had a pretty civil, warm relationship with Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, who was very, very, very religious and very anti any changes in halacha and anti-modernity, even though he was a savvy politician, but he got along personally with Marcus Jastrow, and both of them seem to have been Polish patriots. So so Rav Dov Ber Meizlish participated in this funeral, and Rav Dov Ber Meizlish also had this relationship with the Archbishop, who was one of the heads of the Polish revolt, Polish nationalism in Warsaw. This guy Fialkowski, and Fialkowski invited Rav Dov Ber Meizlish to walk beside him in the funeral, which Rav Dov Ber Meizlish did not want to do because of the crosses and all the Catholic symbolism. So he wanted to participate in the funeral, but not as openly because he wanted to participate in the nationalism, patriotism element of the protest, of the procession, but not in the Catholic ceremonial part of the funeral itself. So he was very careful in what he was supporting. There is a painting made of that funeral that has become one of the most iconic paintings of the entire Polish Jewish history. It is everywhere. If you just Google the words Rav Dov Ber Meizlish or Polish Jewish relations or Polish Jewish patriotism or any of those search words, this painting will come up. You'll see this painting of the funeral of the four. You'll see four caskets of these Polish martyrs killed by the Czarist police from that funeral in the 1861 revolt. And you'll see very prominently painted the painting of Rav Dov Ber Meizlish. He looks like a Hasidic Rav. He was not a Chassid. That's just how a lot of Rabbanim looked at that time. Long beard and payas and a fur hat and a very regal, rabbinical-looking individual. And he's center, right in there, right in the middle of it, because he participated in this demonstration. And that's how Polish Jewish history remembers him. Even his painting, some Polish painter painted a portrait of him, and that became like a bestseller in Warsaw, on streets and in the stores in Warsaw. Regular Poles were buying his painting and putting it up in their house because he's the Jewish rabbi who's a Polish patriot. A fascinating story. Now, like I said, he was financially independent. He was very wealthy, and he, for most of his life, later on in life, he lost most of his money, but for most of his life, he was very wealthy. He already had financed the Polish revolutionary activity in the 1830s in Krakow. He had loaned money to purchase weapons for the 1831 revolt, and he also did not take a salary as a rabbi for most of his life. And he donated most of his rabbinical salary to the poor in Krakow and later on in Warsaw. And when he was in Warsaw, in fact, going back to his Polish patriotism, in the 1846 revolt, he publicly encouraged Jews to actively participate in the fighting of the revolt. Now, this is very different. This is in a speech in the Alte Schule in Krakow, the largest and most prominent shul in Krakow. And here he's not just doing something on his own. He is calling publicly for the Jews to participate. How? To join the fighting. Get weapons and to join the fighting of the revolt, which is fascinating. The 1848 revolt, he met with the Austrian emperor personally to intercede on behalf of the rebels. And that's also when he was elected to the Austrian parliament, what I mentioned before. Now, the question is, was he a Polish nationalist, revolutionary, patriot, or was he just a pragmatic, practical, rabbinical leader who was reading the political landscape and was concerned for the safety of the Jewish community and felt that the best approach for the safety and future and betterment, physical betterment of the Jewish community that he was the leader of, he felt that it was best to publicly espouse these views. That's a very, very crucial and important question because it's the difference between night and day. Now, the non-Jewish Poles certainly believed that he was a Polish nationalist. That's what they believed. And one of their proofs is that in 1848 there was a demonstration within the Jewish community of the people against the kahal, against the Jewish communal leadership, against the kosher meat tax. The people against the elite, the oligarchy. And Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, it seems that he either participated in the demonstration against the kahal, with the people, on the side of the people, or possibly he even organized it. In other words, the Poles pointed this out as he was truly a liberal, truly a man of the people, truly someone who was against the elite, and therefore his Polish nationalism was the same thing. He was against the empire, against the elites of Vienna, and pro the Hamoin Am, the masses of Poles. That would be a interesting idea to examine. Now, he faced all kinds of opposition for his activities, for his Jewish activities within the Jewish community, and for his political activities. As a religious Jewish leader who was so politically active, people expected him to be more moderate within the Jewish community. In other words, to be, he's so political, he's such a Polish patriot, then he must be more progressive, more liberal within the Jewish community. And it wasn't. He wasn't. He was very, very religious. He was against modernity. He was against any changes in halacha and obviously in halacha and in education and in everything. He was very conservative. And the enlightened Jewish community in Krakow and later on in Warsaw, they were opposed to him because he was against any change. He was against the liberalization of the Jewish community, eventually the secularization of the Jewish community. Now, within the religious Kehila, he also had faced that opposition that I mentioned earlier in Krakow from Rav Shaul Landau, a dayan, and interestingly enough, on Rav Shaul Landau's Bezdin, we have this letter. He complained to Rav Shlomo Kluger, who was the most prominent rabbi in Galicia during that time. He said that the rabbi, Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, is too involved in politics, in Polish politics, and he neglects the religious needs of the community. So we have here all this opposition from the secular, from the enlightened, from the progressive and liberal, because he's too frum, he's too religious, he's too conservative. He is involved in Polish politics, and that makes him too much, according to some, that he's not involved in the religious needs of the community. He's too involved in the outside world. So it seems like he's not satisfying too many people. So to get back to our question of what motivated his patriotism, it's likely that what motivated his patriotism was at least partly to prevent Polish anti-Semitism, to prevent Polish pogroms, to prevent pogroms from happening against the Jewish community. If the Jewish community does not publicly support the revolt, if the rabbi doesn't support the revolt, then the Jews are supporting the Tsar. They're supporting the Austrian government, wherever it was. If it was Krakow, it was the Austrian government. If it was in Warsaw, it was the Tsar. And he felt that it's just going to be dangerous for the community, and therefore he has to publicly be patriotic and voice his support for the revolt. So it seems, a lot of the evidence seems to indicate that at least partly it was motivated by that. I don't know if entirely it was. Maybe it partly was actual, true Polish patriotism and Polish nationalism. But at least in part, that's what it was motivated by. In fact, the opposition from the enlightened or the secular elements of the Krakow community was likely the cause of his leaving the Krakow rabbinate. And that's why he had to be hired to become the rabbi of Warsaw, because of that. So he had to leave because he was too frum, too religious for the enlightened and secular elements of the Krakow community. He was staunchly Orthodox. He was very religious as far as rabbis go, as far as the prayer services and the ritual, and opposed to any change. And in fact, during his time in Krakow, there was a debate regarding the second day of Yontif, whether to abolish the second day of Yontif. And he led the opposition to any changes such as that and any others. In fact, there was a famous, in the late 1840s, there was a famous gathering of Reform rabbis in Braunschweig in Germany, and Reb Tzvi Schlerin from Amsterdam, he organized a pamphlet called Teiras HaKanos, the extremism, I don't know, however you want to translate the Kanos, and he asked rabbis from all over Europe to submit their opposition to this Reform rabbi platform, and one of the only Eastern European rabbis to submit to this pamphlet, Teiras HaKanos, was Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, and it was included in it. So he was, his leadership can probably be described that he was a very active Stadlanus of the old school. He was an old school rabbi, but he was very active. He was very charismatic. He was very prominent, very involved, very engaged. But we wouldn't call him a New Age rabbi, because in his religious life and leadership, there was nothing new about him. He was very, very religious and old school. He just had a very savvy and clear understanding of the political world around him, and he used that position and that understanding of his to the betterment of the Jewish community according to his understanding. So his public rabbinical standing and authority. There's a couple of good stories of his public Jewish leadership throughout the Jewish world. In 1867, there was a dispute in the Mir Yeshiva. The Mir Yeshiva, which was owned by the Tiktinsky family of Mir, but the rabbis of Mir were from the Eisenstadt family. And there was a dispute who should be in charge of the Mir. Should the Rosh Yeshiva of the Mir be the rabbi of the town of Mir from the Eisenstadt family, or should the Rosh Yeshiva of the Mir be the Tiktinsky family, the members of the Tiktinsky family who were the Rosh Yeshiva until that point, and who owned the yeshiva and funded it. And they brought this as a din Torah to two prominent rabbis in the Jewish world to resolve this dispute in Mir Yeshiva. And one of them was Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector, the chief rabbi of Kovna, the great Kovna Rav. The other one who was considered a mediator in this dispute was Rav Dov Ber Meizlish. And that's a great story for another time, what they paskind and how they resolved the dispute in the Mir Yeshiva and how the Tiktinskys ran the yeshiva during this time. So hopefully when we get to the history of the Mir one day in the 19th century, we'll speak about it. But it's just interesting that they turned to Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, and he and Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector were the ones who resolved this dispute in the Mir Yeshiva. Another story, much earlier in his career, 1834, just 2 years after he's appointed the rabbi of Krakow, there's a dispute in Krakow regarding the validity of a get, of a divorce document. And Rav Shaul Landau, who was his longtime opponent within Krakow, he claimed that the get was no good. It was the get was pasul, it was not kosher. And it was, against the rabbi of Rav Dov Ber Meizlish, who Rav Shaul Landau did not recognize his authority. He said it is kosher, and it spilled over to the larger Jewish world, as these things tend to do. And two of the greatest rabbis in the Jewish world at that time, Rav Shlomo Zalman Lifshitz, the author of the Chemdas Shlomo, who was the first chief rabbi of Warsaw, he was the chief rabbi of Warsaw at that time, and the Chassam Sofer of Moshe Sofer, who was the chief rabbi of Pressburg and one of the most renowned rabbis in the entire Jewish world at the time, both of them were asked to intervene in this issue. And both of them publicly backed Rav Dov Ber Meizlish unequivocally, not only on halachic grounds, but also they both emphasized, especially the Chassam Sofer, his authority and his position as rabbi, which is interesting. This is a time when the position of the rabbi is shaky, and they're kind of like rebuking Rav Shaul Landau for not supporting the rabbi of the community and by opposing him. So that's an interesting story as well. I actually discovered recently that Rav Dov Ber Meizlish is my direct ancestor, and that's one of the reasons I decided to do this. Through one of his descendants, one of his sons, Shlomo, had to escape Poland after his father was so involved with the Polish revolt in 1861, so he moved to Vienna, and this Shlomo Meizlish changed his name when he lived in Vienna to Rosenfeld, and I come from the Rosenfeld family. In any event, that was one of the impetuses to relating this story. But I think that the story of Rav Dov Ber Meizlish is quite fascinating on its own merits. This is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.